Hello. I think I know all of you in chat. And I suppose you all know me as well. But to anybody who doesn't, welcome. My name is Axaeon. Good to see all of you here. Gentle Catabasis, Tiafair, Terraditto, Slaying Siren. The crew, everybody all here tonight. Makes this office feel like home, you know. Because there are times when I spend in here reading and studying, and it's good and all, you know, I like being able to spend time to myself reading and studying and thinking about things, but really it's just not the same, you know, without having my crew here. So thank you all for coming in and joining me this evening. Today's topic, as you can probably tell from the title, is about philosophical discussion, and in particular I'll be sharing a guide for philosophical discussions that I wrote a while back. Now this guide is directed especially to non-philosophers, but its advice is applicable to everyone. So whether you consider yourself a philosopher or not, my hope is that you will find something in this guide that will help you when it comes to your own discussions of philosophy. But I can share a little bit of the backstory about why I wanted to initially write this guide that was directed mostly to non-philosophers who are thinking of, you know, having their own philosophical discussions. And really it all goes back to the way that I learned philosophy. So if you go back to myself back in my younger days, back when I was a teenager, I would say it's very accurate to say that, yeah, I learned about philosophy in the presence of non-philosophers, through interactions with non-philosophers. It really wasn't until I got to around college, I think, that I started like actually interacting with other philosophers regularly. But I started learning about philosophy before then. And some of you who have heard me speak on this in previous streams will know that I went to a religious school for middle school and high school and some of elementary school. And one of the ways that I became interested in philosophy was thinking about the religious messages that I received and finding that I disagreed with them, but also wanting to understand why, and wanting to understand, like, okay, are these messages true? Are these ideas true? And if not, why not? And so I had many good discussions with the people there at that school, such as my Bible teacher. And these people were not philosophers, but interestingly enough, that was one of the ways that I got into philosophy, by sort of hashing out these discussions with them. I think another way was also just wanting to find out what love is. Yeah, I think when I was a teenager, I was really motivated by that question, and still am. It's still one of my favorite philosophical questions. But I think those two questions, those two areas, were a large part of how I got into philosophy. And again, it wasn't by talking with other philosophers, it was just by talking about these things with like anyone else who wanted to talk about them with me, that I sort of got into it. And because of that experience, I do want to say I think that non-philosophers can certainly contribute very much to philosophical discussions. I know not all philosophers agree. Sometimes philosophers might be a little more gatekeepy about who can or who should participate. What is love, baby? Oh no. The Hathaway song. It was inevitable somebody would bring it up. But yes, it is a great song. And a great answer to that question is just to start giving the lyrics. Yeah, that song reminds me of bowling alleys and skating rinks growing up. Yeah, that's a really good skating rink song. Seriously, you were just a teenager? How romantic of you. Yeah, I've always been very romantic. I think I'm the most romantic person I've ever known. It's probably a subject to get into in a different stream, maybe. But I think I've always had a very romantic imagination. But to return to what I was saying earlier, yeah, I think sometimes philosophers can maybe be a little on the gatekeeping side when it comes to who can contribute to philosophical discussions, whose voice is worth listening to, and so on. Because like my view has always been that, yeah, it doesn't matter if somebody like is technically a philosopher or not. Like, do they have interesting thoughts? And I think non-philosophers can have thoughts that are very much worth sharing and when learning from in philosophical discussions. At least that's been my experience in life. But at the same time, I do agree with the gatekeepers on one thing, which is that when there are philosophical discussions with non-philosophers, one often encounters various obstacles that can get in the way, obstacles that can make the discussions go poorly if they're not, addressed, if they're not confronted. And so the impetus for me to write this guide that I'm about to share with you, that I'm about to read aloud on stream, was thinking through, okay, how could there be, or could there be just a set of advice, a set of principles that might be shared with all that would make discussions of philosophy more productive, like regardless of whoever is participating, like regardless of whether it's a discussion among philosophers or non-philosophers. So that was my hope with this guide. So whether you consider yourself a philosopher or not, I hope that you will find something in this guide that is interesting to you, something that you will find helpful. Again, I think its advice applies to all. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and bring it up. So yes, there you can see what I've written. I'm just going to bring myself over to the side so we can see it. So as you can see, the title of this piece is A Brief Guide to Philosophical Discussion for Non-Philosophers, with the tagline being, "Philosophy is open to all, but doing it effectively requires following some guidelines." This piece should not take super long to read. It's not as long as some of my other blog posts. But after I read it, I figure maybe we can talk about it for a bit. And if you all have further guidelines you'd like to propose, or if you have guidelines, if there are guidelines in this piece that strike you as the most important, or alternatively any that you want to challenge, then we can talk about that here in a few minutes. Philosophy's openness to all. To me, one of the neatest and most beautiful aspects of philosophy is that it is, in an essential way, open to just about everyone. For example, participating in philosophical exchanges doesn't require having an extensive background in some empirical field of study, nor does it require having any advanced technology or specialized equipment with which to conduct experiments. By and large, one can do the core work of philosophy just by thinking. What's more, it's not simply that philosophy is open to all in its fundamental method, namely thinking, but that it positively invites all via the import of its content. That is, philosophical discussions often center on matters that concern everyone. Is there meaning to life? Does anything matter? If so, what matters? How should we live? Is there a God? What can we know? True, not everyone will be interested in questions like these, but such questions still seem important to devote at least some thought to, regardless of one's interests or circumstances. A life in which one gives no consideration whatsoever to foundational questions about what kind of world one lives in, or one's place in it, seems to lack something crucial. Socrates' dictum, "The unexamined life is not worth living," while perhaps a tad hyperbolic, nevertheless gestures at a profound truth. Further, it's not just that non-philosophers should, at least sometimes, think about and discuss philosophy for their own edification. Beyond this, I believe that philosophical discussions themselves often stand to gain from the participation of non-philosophers. That is, non-philosophers will often have important perspectives and insights to share. Such perspectives and insights will perhaps sometimes be informed by a given non-philosopher's own distinct training, for example, scientific training, or life experience, or by being an all-around intelligent person, or by sheer common sense. It would strike me as an egregious kind of gatekeeping to think that philosophical training is a prerequisite for having anything worthwhile to say in philosophical discussions. A pattern of difficulties. And yet, while I wholeheartedly believe that philosophical discussions that include non-philosophers can be of great value, my experiences force me to acknowledge that such discussions all too often run into various impasses and derailments. That is, to put it candidly, there's a host of intellectual and conversational blunders that often crop up among those who lack philosophical training, and these blunders together function to distort or even outright prevent philosophical thinking. The result is a more frustrating discussion experience for everyone, one which, sadly, can make it all the more difficult for non-philosophers to appreciate the value of philosophy. I'll now present a list of what strike me as the most common errors and difficulties that come up in philosophical discussions with non-philosophers. Footnote: while I'm focusing on these errors and difficulties as they come up among non-philosophers, they can, of course, sometimes come up even among philosophers as well. 1. Epistemic arrogance. For those who lack much experience reading, writing, and discussing philosophy, it's often difficult to appreciate how a philosophical issue on which they have a strong opinion, whether it be the existence of God, the moral status of abortion, the just approach to immigration or taxes, or many other matters of controversy, could be subject to reasonable disagreement. It's here that one finds the tendency to assume that the right answer in such disputes is obvious, a tendency that can be present regardless of how extensive and intractable the philosophical debate on such issues has been. Although overconfidence on such matters is sometimes due simply to not knowing about the vastness of the philosophical literature on it, a more unsettling twist is when there's a willingness to immediately dismiss any opinions from the other side that one is presented with. All the more so when those whose opinions one is dismissing have themselves researched the issue at hand much more deeply, and when one is incapable even of summarizing their arguments beyond a soundbite caricature. Among those who embrace epistemic arrogance to such a degree, one often finds an unwillingness or inability to explain their reasoning on the matter at hand, instead defaulting to thought-terminating cliches like, just use your brain, or fine, you can be wrong if you want. 2. An antagonistic standpoint on disagreement. It's common to see people treat philosophical disagreements as a boxing match. The point is not to reach the truth, but to rhetorically beat down your interlocutor. Hence the impulse to whataboutism. On this way of viewing disagreements, it doesn't matter if your opponent lands a hit, that is, makes a decent point, against your view, as long as you can come back with a better hit against her view, even if what you say fails to engage in any way with the point she just made. 3. A dogmatic unwillingness to concede. In large part because of the antagonistic standpoint described above, there's often a flat-out refusal to concede the smallest point, to budge the slightest amount. For that matter, a refusal even to simply admit, when confronted with a challenging objection, that one lacks a response in that moment. Instead, the immediate response, especially when it comes to politically controversial topics, is to dig in one's heels ever more deeply. 4. Cheap psychologizing. A further maneuver that sometimes appears in such discussions is to respond to an argument or position with some variant of, "you only think that because." Such responses tend to shift the focus away from what one might have hoped it would be, namely what the evidence is for the view at hand, and toward an implied attack on the speaker. In particular, that the speaker is not rationally exercising his own intellectual agency and putting forth well-considered reasons that could, in principle, be appreciated by any person who's likewise thinking rationally, but that he is, in his thought, more or less a slave to irrational, parochial influences stemming from his particular life circumstances. This ad hominem element is no doubt a large part of why such a maneuver often leads discussions to become more heated. Reflect for a moment. Have you found that someone's objecting with something like, "you're looking at it from a white male perspective, a woman's perspective, a black perspective, a Jewish perspective, or a privileged perspective," has ever improved a discussion? Footnote. This isn't, oh, sorry, I realized the footnote's partly cut off. I'll just read it anyway. This isn't to suggest that there can never be any interesting or informative genealogical critique. The kind I'm criticizing in this post is the simplistic, jejune, ham-fisted kind. 5, erratically shifting between points and neglecting to adequately develop them. Sometimes an interlocutor will flit about between various points and arguments, each underdeveloped in its turn. Such a person, when challenged on one argument for her view, will respond not by defending the argument she just made, nor even by acknowledging or clarifying the challenge, but simply by bringing up an altogether different argument for the same conclusion, as if the goal were to overwhelm the opposing side by sheer force of numbers, in hope that at least one argument, somewhere along the way, will remain standing. Here's one imagined example involving the debate on abortion. Footnote: in giving this example, I don't intend to impugn anyone's view, nor to suggest anything about my own views. I've chosen abortion for the example simply because it's a convenient, well-worn debate to frame an example around. A. Abortion is wrong. For any child you choose to abort, consider that that child could have been the next Beethoven. B. Or the next Hitler. While the potential that the resulting person would have gone on to do good is indeed there, we also have to take into account the bad he might have done. Doesn't this pose a challenge to that anti-abortion argument? A. Abortion violates the baby's right to life. All beings have a right to live, even the unborn. B. Maybe that's the case, but some would hold that whether a being has a right to life depends on whether it's developed any consciousness. And at least in the early stages of its development, it's not clear whether a fetus has consciousness. A. In choosing to abort, you're taking away the future the baby would have had, and that's wrong. B. I think we're moving a bit fast here. Before we get into that latest argument, could we slow down and talk about whether you have any responses to the objections I've offered to your earlier points? A. Aren't you glad you weren't aborted? In any discussion in which either side shifts the terrain of the debate so rapidly, it'll be difficult to make any progress. 6. Refusal to entertain hypotheticals. Of all the discussion pitfalls listed here, this is, to me, quite possibly the most frustrating to encounter. In response to a thought experiment or hypothetical scenario you put forth, a person will sometimes, perhaps sensing the challenge it otherwise posed to the principles undergirding his view, flat out refuse to engage with the thought experiment, simply on the grounds that it's a hypothetical. Here's an example loosely drawn from a conversation I once had. Other person: gay marriage shouldn't have been legalized. The original definition of marriage, after all, was that it was between a man and a woman. Me: why put any stock in what the original definition might or might not have happened to be? Imagine, for instance, that the original legal definition of marriage held that it could not be interracial, that to count as a marriage, a union had to be between two members of the same race. It seems that your view would then be that interracial marriage should never have been legal. Other: but it didn't happen that way. That wasn't the original definition of marriage. Me: that's not the point. The point is that if it had happened that way, then the principle you're appealing to would have the clearly wrong verdict that, why are you bringing up weird alternative history scenarios? I'm talking about the real world here, bud. A related, though less extreme misunderstanding of thought experiments comes up in responses like the following. Well, what if we just changed the case in such and such a way, to where it wouldn't seem to pose as much a problem to my view? But more flatly, the intended import of such a response seems to be this. It doesn't matter that you might have just posed a counterexample to my view, because here's this other case, a case that's not a counterexample. None of these blunders and roadblocks, some might argue, should be too surprising. After all, the core work of philosophy, namely thinking, is in principle open to all, that the core work of philosophy, namely thinking, is in principle open to all, doesn't mean that everyone is going to automatically be adept at the kind of thinking philosophy involves, nor that having had philosophical training will not improve one's ability to participate fruitfully in this kind of discussion. Even bearing that in mind, though, it still seems to me that philosophical discussions involving non-philosophers are often ground down by the above difficulties more than they need to be. For this reason, I'd now like to propose some foundational guidelines for philosophical thinking and discussion. Ones applicable, of course, to everyone, though addressed here primarily to those who are approaching philosophy as newcomers or outsiders. Some guidelines for better philosophical discussions. 1. Understand that your view could be mistaken. This minimal level of open-mindedness, or epistemic humility, is close to being a necessary condition for a genuine discussion. Without it, a discussion tends to be more a matter of talking at, or sometimes shouting at, rather than talking with. The need for at least minimal open-mindedness is especially great when it comes to issues that you yourself have not spent a great deal of time researching the opposing side's arguments on, or attempting to state their arguments fairly. 2. See a discussion not as a battle between enemies, but as a collaborative endeavor to reach the truth. Unless someone has given you a specific reason for thinking that she's engaging in bad faith, where this reason can't just be she supports view X, which I think is a bad view, assume that she's approaching the discussion in good faith. If you and your interlocutor disagree about the issue in question, then there seem to be 3 possibilities. 1. Your view is correct, in which case the discussion is a good opportunity to help the other come closer to the truth. 2. The other's view is correct, in which case the discussion is an opportunity for her to help you come closer to the truth. Or 3. Both your views are incorrect, in which case the discussion could still help both of you become better aware of the flaws in your respective views, flaws which might well motivate a search for a better view. As long as what you're ultimately after is indeed the truth, a good faith discussion should be nothing to fear. 3. Know that there's no shame in conceding a point. If your interlocutor raises a point that you don't have a response to in the moment, it's fine to acknowledge that. Sometimes the topic or objection at hand is complex and challenging enough to require time to think through, and it's unrealistic to expect always to have an immediate riposte ready for any challenge your view encounters. If you think of a reply later, perhaps you could bring it up then and see what the other thinks, circumstances permitting. Or maybe you could simply change your mind on the issue in the end. There's no shame in that either. In a mature discussion, being willing to concede a point is taken as a sign of strength, not weakness. 4. Avoid cheap psychologizing. In general, avoid trying to analyze your interlocutor's motivations, especially if you're imagining them as hidden or disreputable motivations for his view. In a philosophical discussion, the major question at hand usually isn't about what beneath the surface factors might be motivating a belief. It's whether the belief is true. Focus on the evidence for or against the belief, rather than trying to psychologize your interlocutor. 5. Be intentional about shifting to a new point. Always try to resolve the present point or argument before moving to a new one, even if that resolution simply takes the form of acknowledging that the current argument needs more work, or that you'll need to think of your interlocutor's objections more. Refrain from responding to an objection by simply and suddenly pivoting to a new argument for your view. 6. Be willing to entertain hypotheticals. Don't dismiss a thought experiment simply because it's hypothetical, as this is such a crucial guideline for philosophical discussion, and as a failure to grasp it betrays a deep misunderstanding of how philosophy works. I'd like to take some time to explain it in more depth. When explaining or defending our position on a philosophical matter, we always, at some level, appeal to principles. Consider, for example, someone who claims that it's wrong to tell children that Santa Claus exists, because doing so is lying, and lying is always wrong. Someone might then challenge this principle, that lying is always wrong, on the ground that it doesn't seem wrong to lie to an axe murderer who asks you where your friend is hiding. If the first person replies by disputing whether such an axe murderer situation has in fact happened, this would obviously miss the point. The reason this would miss the point is that, if indeed, as the first person in the exchange proposed, lying is always wrong, then it's wrong not just in circumstances that have happened or are currently happening, but in hypothetical circumstances as well. For instance, if it's true that lying is always wrong, then you can immediately deduce that it would be wrong to lie to your next-door neighbor, even if you haven't ever in fact lied to her. That principles, like lying is always wrong, apply across the board to all possible circumstances is what gives them their explanatory power. Footnote. For example, if the person making the argument above denied that lying is always wrong, that would immediately call into question his argument that it's wrong to lie to children about Santa. If, say, lying is only sometimes wrong after all, then the argument would need to be supplemented with some reason for thinking that lying to children about Santa is one of the wrongful instances of lying, rather than one of the okay ones. And in turn, any reason that would let us make such a distinction would be, or suggest, a principle that would itself apply across the board, to all possible circumstances, or else we'd run into the same problem again. It is also what makes them vulnerable to counterexamples. Whether the circumstances described in a counterexample have ever in fact come about, or whether they're merely possible, is neither here nor there. For a closely related reason, simply proposing some changes to a counterexample does not rebut it. In the context of the axe murderer case, this maneuver would look like this. Well, what if we just change the case so that your friend is about to detonate a bomb that will destroy the entire planet, and telling the axe murderer where he's hiding so that the axe murderer goes on to kill him is the only way to stop your friend from blowing up everyone? Wouldn't it be okay to tell the axe murderer the truth then? Regardless of whether it's right, as most would agree, to tell the axe murderer where your friend is hiding in that case, the trouble is that that's simply a different case from the one we started with. And so even though that case might not be a counterexample to the principle that lying is always wrong, we still have an apparent counterexample to that principle, namely the case in which we don't make any outlandish assumptions about what your friend is about to do, but simply stipulate that he's a normal person who's hiding in fear of his life, and that lying to the axe murderer about where he is the only way of saving him. It doesn't matter how many cases are not counterexamples. If even one case anywhere is a counterexample to a principle, that shows the principle to be false. It is my hope that, by keeping these guidelines in mind, we can have more fruitful philosophical discussions, ones wherein philosophers and non-philosophers can learn more from one another. So that is the end of that piece. That's right, yep. No more on that particular one. Also, apologies for forgetting this earlier, but I just realized normally when I'm doing these readings, I include a pinned comment with a link to it, which I forgot to do this time. But if anybody wants to see it now, I'm just going to pin this message. So now you can go back and if there's anything you want to kind of check for yourself, anything that you want to sort of read on your own or just have it on hand, now you can feel free to do so. So with that in mind, yeah, I'd be curious to hear from you all if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on this piece. These could be any challenges, any thoughts on like if there's a guideline that seems to you like the most important one, or if you've ever had any philosophical discussions with non-philosophers. Perhaps you're a non-philosopher yourself who's had philosophical discussions. And if so, I'd be curious to know how they've gone for you. I'm just looking back at the comments right now, which I know I wasn't able to look at earlier. Socrates quote came to my mind too. Yeah, that is one of philosophy's classic quotations, so it's a good one to think of in connection to this subject. Tia says, I want to raise an objection to the part about psychologizing. Okay. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your objection, Tia, so please, at any point, feel free to post it in the chat. Tiradito says, there's someone that dislikes telling kids that Santa is real. I'll go through it later, because sadly can't listen much right now. Okay. Yeah, no need to worry about that, Tiradito. No need to worry that is about not being able to listen much right now. I know that everyone has different schedules and everything. But yeah, the good news is that, yeah, the written post will always be there in case you ever want to return to it. But for your earlier comment, Tiradito, it says, Yeah, there's someone that dislikes telling kids that Santa is real. I'm sensing a bit of disbelief in this comment. Like, how could anybody be against telling kids that Santa is real? If I've misunderstood your comment and that was not the spirit in which you intended it, I apologize. But it seems to me that's perhaps the spirit in which it was intended. And yeah, if it is, then there's actually been some interesting discussion on Philosophy Substack on this. It was a while back, maybe like a year or so ago, but some philosophical Substack bloggers had an exchange over like whether it's wrong to lie to kids about Santa. And I think it's actually like a fairly interesting debate, because like I know when I was a kid, like people, just like adults in general, were like, yeah, Santa, like he's coming. Are you ready for Santa to come? And like I was like into it. I was like, yeah, like Santa, like let's go. But like I'm thinking now, like would I do that now if I were raising a kid? And I think I probably would not. I think I probably would refrain from speaking to them about Santa as if Santa is an actually existing person. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't talk to them about Santa at all. Like, I think I would be willing to sort of play along in the game and like tell them things like, oh, okay, like Santa's coming. As long as I also made clear, like at other times, that like, hey, this is all just like make believe, but like we can pretend and like play around with it and have fun. But really, you know, this is make believe. I think it's important to be clear with kids on like what's make believe and what's not. And so that's probably how I would do it if I were raising a kid. But I know different people have different thoughts on this. There are plenty of philosophers who would not agree with me on that point and would say like, no, it's fine just to straight up tell kids like, yeah, Santa is real, and not necessarily, you know, have to go into the whole spiel about how it's just make believe. I'm so late. Oh, no worries, Violet. Yeah, I just finished reading the piece, but I do have a pinned comment in the chat. So if you want to read what the piece says, you can go ahead and take a look at it, and it will always be there. But anyway, welcome. It's good to see you around. So right now we're just talking about guidelines for philosophical discussion and what might be the most helpful guidelines for discussions, especially discussions that involve non-philosophers, or when philosophers and non-philosophers are talking. So that's kind of the focus of the piece. Tia says, my concern about a rule about no psychologizing is that it's not like humans are logic machines. We'll have some degree of bias, and the best we can do is to be aware of it as possible. Okay, so I'm just gathering my thoughts on this one. So Tia, I think we agree on this, that people naturally have bias. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to find someone who is perfectly objective. So that seems right. I think my follow-up question would be whether it's of any value in a philosophical discussion, like a discussion about some particular claim under debate, whether it's of any value to try to like probe people's biases or like root out people's biases, or sort of like shine a magnifying glass on them, as it were. Just because I think that usually when that's done, it shifts attention away from like whatever the original issue was and more about like what are the person's motivations for believing a claim. Which is not to say like that's never worth talking about, so I don't want to make that strong a claim. But I do think in general, when that happens, it makes people feel defensive. It makes people feel as if their intellectual agency is being denied or being undermined. And so like I know when I'm in a philosophical discussion with someone else, I always try to avoid telling them things of the sort like, you only believe that because you're in such and such circumstance, or you have such and such background. My interest has always been mostly in just like, what is their evidence for the claim in question? And I know that's the way I always hope that others will treat me in a philosophical discussion. But I see you have a follow-up comment, so let's see what the follow-up comment is. In a discussion where the other party is disregarding the truth for wishful thinking, and it's clear to you their stance comes from personal bias, is it fair to point that out rather than continue? Okay, good. So I like how this comment is asking us to think of a particular case, because I think that that is really helpful in terms of like how we sort of make progress in discussions like these. So yeah, for a case like that, where it just seems to me that the other person is clearly wrong and is clearly engaging in wishful thinking, and that their stance comes from their own bias. So that your question was, is it fair to point that out rather than continue? Here, I would point it out in some form, but I think maybe not quite using the language that maybe is implied by your comment, if I'm understanding your comment correctly. So that is, I would be happy to point out that their viewpoint has very little evidence for it. Like, let's say that they believe something that there's almost no evidence for, but like a lot of evidence against, then sure, I would be willing to point out, like, look, the balance of evidence is very much against this claim, that you're putting forth. And I think that that might be enough. Like, it's not clear to me that I would need to say more than that, or to put it in terms of like, oh, you only believe this because you're biased. What I suspect would be the most likely outcome, like if I added on to that by saying, oh, by the way, the only reason you believe this is just because you're indulging in this, highly personal bias. I think that the likely effect that would have is just to make the other person more defensive than they would otherwise be, and probably less likely to take seriously anything that I say about like what the evidence at hand is for the claims in question. So yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm generally inclined to avoid shifting the discussion to, talking about what people's biases might or might not be. I think really the most powerful thing is when, like, let's say that I am able to show them that the evidence is on balance against whatever their view is. Even if they don't accept that in the moment, like maybe in the moment they go on sort of adhering to their view, it's quite possible that later they will reflect on it a bit more and will come to see like, oh, okay, like, Axaeon was right. And then they might realize on their own, like, hey, the reason why I was so attached to this view that I had, it really came down to personal bias. I think that's a realization that people are more likely to have sort of on their own, where it's natural to feel a little less defensive if they're just sort of coming to it on their own in the wake of a discussion. But I think if you try to sort of force people to that realization by like bringing it up very directly about what their biases might be, it seems to me that that is likely to backfire and just make people sort of retreat into their own cage and like maybe not be as willing to concede points. Again, that's just my own sense from my own experiences. What if until you actually point out the root cause, they keep inventing new excuses for why their stance must be true? Okay, so yeah, interesting follow-up. I think I would say in that point that, like, if we've been going on for a while and I've been kind of showing how each new excuse doesn't really hold up, I think there's perhaps a way of helping them come to an understanding of their bias, but like without sort of explicitly suggesting like that one is making a charge, that they are biased. So, for example, one thing that I think one could do in that kind of case is adopt kind of a Socratic approach and maybe just sort of ask the other person. You can just say like, it seems like this is a very important view to you. Why do you think that is? Or why do you think it is that you feel drawn to this view? And I think it's difficult to pull off sometimes, but if one can raise questions like that with a very non-judgmental tone, I think sometimes that can help the other person to start, getting closer to an understanding of what their motivations might be. And I think if one does it that way, the other person is, again, likely to become less defensive than if they sense that you're making an accusation against them, of being biased. I think it depends on the situation. Personally, I sometimes find having my attachment pointed out is validating rather than offensive, and is a key step in moving forward. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a case in my own experience that would be like that. I mean, I suppose it depends on like what kind of attachment we're thinking of. So yeah, if you want to specify a little further, T, I'm happy to think of a more specific example. But at the same time, if you would rather not, like if it's too personal, then that's fine. But that is interesting to me to hear that that's been your experience. Okay, thanks for the tip on handling difficult, non-philosophical people, Professor. Yep, you've got it, Tia. You're very welcome. So on that note, another question that I had and was thinking of is if you had to sort of rank, and this could be like the guidelines that you just saw in the guide that I shared, or just more general guidelines. Doesn't have to be limited to the ones that I've shared. But is there a guideline that seems to you, chat, like the most important one for philosophical discussions to have? Like the guideline that makes the biggest difference, or the practice that makes the biggest difference in whether a philosophical discussion turns out productively or not? Because for me, that is a tricky question. Like when I look at all of the guidelines that I at least shared, I'm not sure if there's one that seems to me like the most important one. I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is maybe the one about avoiding epistemic arrogance, like having enough epistemic humility to recognize the possibility that you're mistaken. Because I think that, like, that one maybe leads to some of the other issues. Like if you don't have that basic epistemic humility, then you're at least much more likely to fall into those other blunders of, like, you know, viewing disagreements in an antagonistic way, or not being willing to engage with thought experiments, engage with hypotheticals. So yeah, I suppose that might be at least my best attempt at an answer. That maybe understanding that your view could be mistaken is perhaps the most important. But even then, it's still tricky. Like when I look at the others of, like, you know, see the discussion not as a battle between enemies, but as a collaborative endeavor to reach the truth. Like that one's crucial as well. Or like knowing that there's no shame in conceding a point, like be willing to entertain hypotheticals. So yeah, I guess I would say there's no single guideline that seems to me like it stands out like far above the others in terms of importance. But if I had to pick one, I suppose I would pick the one about having that basic epistemic humility. But on that note, another thing that I would be interested in asking you all, are there any guidelines that you would add to this discussion? Like any guidelines that you've found, any practices that you found in your own experience to help philosophical discussions be productive? Because even though the ones that I shared with you seem to me like ones that are really crucial, there is no attempt here to be exhaustive. Like I fully acknowledge there are very likely other guidelines that would help philosophical discussions to be good. And to the extent that there are, I might actually end up, you know, expanding this piece someday, maybe adding some things to it. So that would not surprise me. For me, the key one is viewing your partner as a collaborator rather than an adversary. Like everything else flows naturally from that attitude. Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a respectable answer too. Because I can see how, like, if one has that attitude, then, like, even if you don't have the epistemic humility, like, let's say that you're certain that your view is correct, you just accord no credence at all, no possibility at all that you acknowledge that the other person's view is correct, but nevertheless, like, you view them as a collaborator and not an adversary, then maybe in the process of collaborating with them, you come to see, like, hey, the case, you know, is not as certain as you might have thought. Like, maybe that helps you go on to moderate your confidence in your view. Yeah, like, to me, that doesn't seem strange to imagine, like, a process like that happening. It might be too personal. I don't want to monopolize the chat, but I appreciate the offer, though. Okay, yeah, perfectly fair, perfectly, yeah, that makes sense. Another question I'm thinking of right now is like, when is the last time I've had a philosophical discussion with a non-philosopher? I mean, I guess in a way, like for me, most of my philosophical thinking occurs either when I'm like writing something by myself or reading books. And those are usually by other philosophers. Every once in a while, someone from my family might, ask me a philosophical question and we might talk about it a little bit. So yeah, I suppose that would be the answer I would give. Which is probably the case for a lot of philosophers too. Like maybe when they're talking with their families, their family members might think like, oh, this person is a philosopher. Maybe I should ask them about this question I've been pondering about, the meaning of life. One of the things that I've noticed about getting questions from non-philosophers like that is that the questions that non-philosophers ask about philosophy tend to be very broad. So questions like, what is the meaning of life? Broader perhaps than the usual questions that philosophers study. I think when it comes to like articles published in academic journals, for example, the topics that they are addressed to are usually much narrower. But I do think there's a lot of value in being able to be confronted by those very general questions and not lose sight of them. Not just letting all of one's philosophical attention be focused on hyper-specific minutiae. Because that can happen sometimes, especially if you're in a university context and like, let's say you're in an academic job teaching philosophy and you're trying to get enough publications for tenure or promotions or for what have you, or maybe you're a grad student and trying to get enough publications to go on to be, hired in your first job. Or for that matter, like even if you're like an undergrad and like want to go to grad school, I think it can be very easy sometimes to fall into this habit of just focusing on like, okay, what's the next very specific, very narrowly targeted topic that's like going to get me a publication like or a conference presentation. So that's one thing I like about getting confronted with philosophical questions from non-philosophers, is that they, I think, can be very helpful for sort of calling one back to a focus on, or at least to an awareness of the more general, in some ways perhaps more foundational questions that I think philosophy is in many ways at its most interesting when it tries to really engage with those kinds of questions. I know what you mean. That has big Reddit AMA energy. I might have forgotten by this point exactly what that comment is referring to. I guess like if one doesn't have confidence in one's partner as like a collaborator and thinks of them as an adversary. Or maybe not. Maybe I've just forgotten which part of the discussion that was. But yeah, big Reddit AMA energy. Sometimes I do feel a little bit like that when giving streams like this. That is, insofar as people can ask questions, it's kind of like, hey, ask me pretty much anything, and I sort of get to respond to it. So I can see a parallel there. But yeah, in a moment, I am probably going to go. Because I don't know if I told you. Actually, I know I did tell you all in yesterday's stream. But for anyone who wasn't there, this Friday and Saturday, and for some of Sunday, I'm actually going to be gone out of state for a wedding. So I will not be streaming this weekend. But I do still need to pack for that. So I'll be doing that in just a moment. But, oh yeah, Tia says AMA equals ask me anything. Okay, yeah, that's ask me anything. Like, if you made one, I'm sure you'd get what is the meaning of life. Oh, I see, okay. Yeah, I knew what Reddit AMAs were, but I hadn't made the connection to like the what is the meaning of life on a Reddit AMA. Oh man, I just got here. Oh well, I VOD'd up. That's right, yeah, the VOD will still be here, Toynbee. Also, in the pinned comment in the chat, if you want to read the document that I read on stream for today, that document is there. So just know that that's another way you have available if you'd like to engage with it that way. Ooh, Axe is a last-minute packer. Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes. Enjoyed listening in. Have fun over the weekend. Oh, thank you, Slaying Siren. I hope you have fun over the weekend, too. Oh, I like your little emojis, like the pizza and the house and the little celebration. Yeah, I think it should be pretty good. But at the same time, I am looking forward to, like, even though I haven't left yet, I'm looking forward to coming back home so I can have some more streams next week that are going to be quite fun. I think one of them in particular is going to be a really cool stream. I'm not going to say anything about it yet. I'm going to leave you on suspense, but next week, perhaps especially on Saturday, there's going to be a stream that I think is very much worth tuning into. And it won't just be, it's going to be a collab. Maybe I've already said too much, but Saturday, I will have more details to share on that sometime next week. Good luck with your journey. Oh, thank you, Terraditto. And good luck to you as well with all of your endeavors. So again, that's all for tonight. Thanks, everyone. And I will see you all next time. Have a good time in your philosophical discussions. Bye, everybody. Goodbye.